welcome to the Benjamin Franklin Virtual Screening and Discussion event.
Hi, I'm Ken Burns. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this local event for our newest film, Benjamin Franklin, in which we explore the colorful and consequential life of one of the most influential Americans of all time. Storytelling is at the heart of public media, and we're honored to have the support of your local station, which makes it possible for us to tell complicated stories like this one. Thank you for being here today.
Good evening. My name is Mitch Gelman, President and CEO of WCNY. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Benjamin Franklin Virtual Screening and Discussion. WCNY is pleased to host this event in partnership with Upstate Oasis. We are excited to bring you a documentary about one of the 18th century's most consequential and compelling personalities. Benjamin Franklin's 84 years spanned a period of momentous change in science, technology, literature, politics, and government. Fields he himself advanced through a lifelong commitment to societal and self-improvement over the course of 7 decades. Franklin climbed both the professional and social ladders, rising from a printer's apprentice in provincial Boston to the most popular man in Paris. Throughout his life, he wrote influential essays, coined words and phrases we still use today, and contributed to the foundation of the United States of America. Franklin's influence was unmatched in his time, and his impact remains with us today. We are pleased that tonight's event will feature a panel discussion with David Schmidt, producer of Benjamin Franklin, and Tom Henry, a distinguished social studies teacher and historian, and a live question and answer session following the screening. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Welcome to tonight's Benjamin Franklin live panel discussion. I'm Ruben Wright, and I'll be your moderator for tonight's discussion. 2 notable individuals are joining me tonight to talk about the history and life of Benjamin Franklin. Our guests are David Schmidt, producer of Benjamin Franklin, and Tom Henry, a retired social studies teacher and historian. We have prepared some questions for both our guests, but we'd also like to hear from you. So please put your questions in the Zoom chat, and we'll be sure to get to as many of them as possible. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into question number 1 for our panelists. So I'm going to jump right off, and I'm going to start with, how did Benjamin Franklin contribute to the American independence? Would America have prevailed in the American Revolution without Benjamin Franklin? Tom, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, he's enormously important to the American Revolution. First of all, he's the best known American in the world. If he's not there, if he's not supporting the revolution, it loses a lot of its popular mill with the people. He's that important. People know who he is. And so when he's supporting the revolution, hey, Ben Franklin's doing that. That's important. But what we most know him for, of course, he goes to France. And he's the best person to go for France. He's enormously popular in France. They know him. They've read his material. A lot of it's been translated into French. Poor Richard's has been translated. So he goes to France as an emissary from the United States, a new nation with no power, really. And he's going to go and convince King Louis XVI to put up ships, to put up money, to put up troops, to overthrow another king. That's astounding. We also had nothing here. We had no way to make gunpowder. Guns were made by gunsmiths in town, so we had no major gunsmithing or armories. We depended on the French. The French loved Franklin. He knew that. He was patient. His diplomacy is outstanding, and it's really he that convinces the French to come on to our side as a military aid, and then also to finance us even past the revolution. So the simple answer to the second is, would we have won? No, not without Ben Franklin.
And David, and you as being a producer of this film, you've dug into the records, you've dug into actually looking at some of these background details. The same question to you, what do you think Benjamin Franklin's impact was to the American independence?
Sure. I mean, I don't like to say what wouldn't have happened if somebody hadn't done something, but I can say without hesitation that the way the American Revolution played out the way it did because of the work of a lot of people, but no one more so than Benjamin Franklin. So as Tom said, when he lent his name to the revolution, that just gave it a lot of legitimacy that it may not have had before. Part of that is how famous he was, how accomplished he was, how well loved he was in Philadelphia and in North America. But also, he had spent most of the last 20 years in England, right inside of the hub of empire. And so if he comes back and says, yeah, this isn't going to work, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you maybe this British Empire isn't for us. So I think that really did matter, and for all the reasons that Tom said, plus the one that I just gave. Also, when he went to France, everything Tom said is true. But on top of that, he's famous for his writings. He's also famous for his science. And it's notable that during this period, Turgot, who's a French peer of Franklin's, an Enlightenment figure, said that he stole the lightning from the heavens, and so that's the electricity, and now the scepter from the tyrants. And what a thing to say when your head of state is a king. So the way the revolution plays out, in particular the Battle of Yorktown, which was won by, more than anything, the French military. It doesn't happen without Benjamin Franklin's role. I mean, at Yorktown, it's American Continental Army under Washington, and it's American militia. Even they are outfitted by French uniforms, arms, munitions, etc. And then it's an equal number of French army soldiers and the French Navy, which trapped Cornwallis in Chesapeake Bay. So yes, maybe we as Americans win a different war, a protracted guerrilla warfare. We would have emerged as a country in tatters. So for war to end as quickly as it did in 8.5 years isn't particularly quick. It took Franklin. I think that's true.
And I kind of want to stay with this question, kind of a little follow-up to both of you. And David, I'll leave with you, leave with you is, when we think of this, we always think of Benjamin Franklin, kind of the, American hero, as people would say here. But do you feel he was a reluctant revolutionary right at the start, maybe those early days of kind of breaking away from the king and from England?
So it depends when you're talking about. I think when Benjamin Franklin made his decision to join the rebellion, he went in full bore. But he didn't want to split from the British Empire, and he spent most of the last, I said 20 years in England, but it's more than that he spent as a servant of empire. He was a crown-appointed postmaster, and that meant that he was building empire in North America through the colonial postal system, and he also negotiated with Native American Indians west of the settlements on the eastern seaboard in an effort to expand white settlement westward as part of the British Empire. He's writing in the middle of the century about the British Empire's future in America, and maybe there'll be a second capital in North America. Maybe it'll be Philadelphia. So he really believed in the British Empire, and at the time of the 7 Years' War, at the end of the 7 Years' War, he's glorying in the fact that he, like his king, is a Briton. He wanted Canada as part of the British Empire, and he wrote extensively about that, arguing for that. So I don't think it's. I think he's a reluctant revolutionary because he had lived 7 decades of Britain. Mm-hmm. But when he realized, and he's made to realize this publicly in a public humiliation in London, in a building called the Cockpit, which you'll learn about if you watch the full film, he changed his mind. And when he did, he dove in full bore and was as much in favor of independence as anybody before a lot of the people who he met when he got back to Philadelphia in 1775.
And Tom?
Yeah, I agree with what David's saying. And again, the whole idea is he had spent enormous amounts of time in England. He loved England, and why not? He's celebrated there. He gets invited to great country estates. He meets the king. He's very, very British. And as David said, there's an incident. It's called the Cockpit Fight. And he eventually, as Boston is sliding into revolution, Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Boston, writes a series of letters back to England about how they can suppress the revolution. What do they need to do? Well, Franklin acquires those letters, 6 of them, and he sends them back to Boston with the proviso, of course, don't print these. These are private. Well, of course, as soon as you say that, what's going to happen? Everybody's going to print them, and they're printed, and they're just incendiary. And so the word gets back to England, and he's called before the Privy Council. Now, he thinks he's being called for other political reasons, and it turns out that for all practical purposes, he's being put on trial for exposing Hutchinson's papers. And the prosecutor was the attorney general for the Empire, a guy named Wedderburn, who's just brutal. He's a Scotsman, and he's known for his just literally brutality. He abuses Franklin for an hour. They jeer at him, they laugh at him and all that. And Franklin says nothing. He leaves. But one of the historians comments that Ben Franklin went into the cockpit as a loyal Englishman and walked out a rebel American. And that's true. And from that point on, he really is very much pro-revolution. It's just not going to work in the British Empire.
And look out, I'm right behind you on the TV.
With that, I kind of want to stay in the same vein, but kind of shift a little focus to kind of a topic and an interesting thing that a lot of people think of. So when we think of Benjamin Franklin, I think everyone thinks of, his accomplishments and all the good. But I know, David, you guys kind of mentioned in the documentary there, you hit a little bit on his ownership of slaves. So kind of one major thing in Franklin's life early on was his reluctance to really be an abolitionist. And it wasn't until later on that he became one and actually kind of, owned up to a lot of those things and things like that. But what I want to get from kind of both of you guys is, why do you think it took him that long to kind of become the abolitionist that a lot of people now see him, later on in his life?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned early on in his life that he enslaved people. He's doing that in middle age. He can't blame the failures of youth for that. That's something he knew. He had to know what the evil was of enslaving people. If you have an enslaved person in your home preparing your food or doing your laundry or working in your print shop, you're living with the fact and the horrors of slavery daily. So I think he knew, and I think he knew all along. It's not that he came along late to the idea that this was wrong. What I think is an interesting way to look at it, and the way that I find value in looking at it this way, is to think about how he and a lot of his peers lived and grew up and were born into a system that they probably knew was immoral, but it was what they knew. And so there are a lot of systems like that we live with today. And I think that Franklin, by the end of his life, was no longer personally reliant on slave labor daily. And he had spent a lot of time around the world, in London and in Paris. And the values of the American Revolution are all men are created equal. And that's coded into our founding. So it just became harder to hide behind the hypocrisy. And so by the end of his life, when he didn't have that personal stake and personal benefit from slavery, and the tide of rhetoric had changed, where it was pretty clear that, a lot of people believed loudly that this was wrong. He lent his name to the abolition movement, and that mattered. It mattered, again, like it mattered with the American Revolution, that somebody of Benjamin Franklin's stature was behind abolitionism. It mattered that behind the revolution, it mattered that he was behind abolitionism. So yes, it's the last public act of his life. I don't know that we can give him too much credit for living by that standard, because it was only in the last few years of his life, but it mattered. And what I always think of is and we'll, I'm sure, talk about it because it's something that came up in the clips, but that whole idea of self-improvement, of self-reflection, of I can be better than who I am, it manifests itself no better than it does with his relationship to servitude and slavery.
Absolutely. And Tom, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I think what David said was elegant and well stated. And it's also true, but you're also going to find that one of the historians in this program will tell you that slavery just wasn't talked about very much prior to that statement in the Declaration. It's a fact of life. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't opponents. And of course, Franklin, being in Philadelphia, is exposed to those opponents. They're coming out of the Quaker world as early as 1688. You have the Germantown Query, which is just north of Philadelphia. He knows Antoine Benezet, who was one of the early abolitionists. He's trying to found a school for Black children. Same thing with George Whitefield. He knows George Whitefield. He's raising money for, likewise, a school that never happens, but he's raising money for it. So he's exposed to this, and he's printing the Quaker works as well. So this is something that is part of his background. But again, as it was implied both in the program and David sort of implied, it just wasn't talked about at that point. It was part of life. And then all of a sudden, you have this, all men are created equal. And all of them in that room knew that this is not jiving with slavery. And they all knew that. These are not stupid men. Now the problem is, all right, how do you rectify that? How do we talk about liberty for everybody? How do we talk about all men created equal and yet hold these enslaved people? And that's going to be the essential argument of America from 1776 until 1865. And of course, we still feel the ripples from that today. So it's an evolutionary process. And again, this is a man who's constantly reinventing himself, and eventually he comes to the right conclusion.
And with that, I kind of want to stay with this kind of topic of not necessarily African Americans, but shifting to a focus of women. So kind of, David, I'm going to start off with you kind of as a question that was asked in chat. But I think I might have an answer to this because we just watched some clips of it. But are there any women that are featured in the actual documentary piece?
Yes. By name, most notably are his wife, Deborah, who was a business partner of his, and also the mother of 2 of his children. And they have a robust, successful business together. And he leaves her to pursue a diplomatic career in England. She chose not to go with him. It was something that they agreed upon. This was not uncommon for there to be relationships that were tested by the ocean. Think of whalers. They're gone for years. But it is something that is worth considering. He left his wife, again, agreed upon, but he did, and he promised he would come back, and he did for a couple of years in the middle. But after she was stricken by she had a series of strokes and was suffering and just kept asking for him to come back. There's letters, tragic letters, where she's saying, "When will it be in your power to return home?" He doesn't come back. He doesn't come back until after she dies. The trip across the ocean takes weeks, especially coming east to west. So he misses her funeral as well. And as far as I've found, the only reference he has to her death is that he says, "Oh, well, she was managing my affairs in Philadelphia, so now I've got to go back and manage my own affairs in Philadelphia." So she's the number one person that we feature. His daughter, Sarah Sally Bache, is also featured. She's a remarkable individual. Franklin could be cruelest to his own family, and he could be sometimes with Sally as well. He didn't give her all the opportunities he gave his son William. There's another story, and they were divided over the Revolution. And there's also Benjamin Franklin's younger sister, Jane, who Jill Lepore wrote a fantastic book about that I would recommend to anybody, called Book of Ages. We know about her as posterity knows about her, probably from her more than anything, probably basically only. Sorry, I should rephrase that. Jill Lepore, it's called Book of Ages because there's a document where Jane Franklin Meekum wrote down the names of her children, and she called it the Book of Ages. Other than that, we really know about her from her letters to her brother. And so that book is just a really wonderful examination of people whose circumstances are so similar, except she's a woman and he's a man. And what opportunities, nobody is Ben Franklin probably, but she stayed in Boston her whole life and he traveled the world and did so much. And she was kept from doing that for the fact that she was a woman and had a child young and had to stay and take care of their family. And so we don't get into all of that with this film because it's a film about Benjamin Franklin, but I really encourage people to take our film and say, "Oh, Jane Franklin, that's an interesting person. Let me look a little bit more about her." You'll find all sorts of stuff. Franklin also interacted with lots of women throughout his life, including in Paris. And we talk a little bit about 2 of the women who he had flirtations with, one of whom he kind of proposed marriage to. Those aren't as significant as those other familial relationships I talked about. And then there's a couple of names that we don't really get to in the film itself, but I think are really fascinating, where he kind of mentors young women and encourages them to pursue science or other intellectual pursuits. So yeah, he corresponded with women as well as men. And the fact of the 18th century is there weren't a lot of women in any of the professional circles, aside from sometimes from printmaking. But there's a lot to be found in the papers of Benjamin Franklin about what he thought about specific women, at least.
And Tom, the specific part I want to ask you to touch upon is that whether it be the women that David brought up or some that you're reading in studies as well, but how did these women directly influence Franklin? Was it his inventions? Was it his statesmen, or was it all?
Well, first of all, Benjamin Franklin likes women. There's absolutely no question about that. Flirtatious is the term that we use oftentimes with younger women, and not necessarily the women in his family, as David suggested. You can actually, he doesn't exactly abuse his family, but he kind of pushes them aside and adopts other families, the Stevensons particularly, the family that he stays with in London. And he's very enamored with Polly Stevenson, and then later on with Katie Ray Green. These are young women who he finds intellectually stimulating. They're curious, they're interested. He writes, I think it's Katie Ray that he ultimately writes 160 some odd letters to, even after she's married. So he has this relationship with her, and he talks to her about science, he talks to her about life in general, the philosophical types of things, as he would a younger man, really. And now that doesn't mean that she's going to have the same opportunities, of course, but he does have those interesting relationships with these women that he doesn't have with his wife. Deborah was, if you read her writings, it's nowhere near as elegant as his. She's nowhere near as well educated. He does comment that she's a good wife, a good helpmate, but he also kind of casts her aside. For the last 15 years of her life, he's gone for 13 of them. And so it's not like he's just rushing back to see her, but these other women, he has these rather interesting conversations and relationships with. So they are important.
So much, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Step on you. There's so much that we just don't know and can't know, and what we do know is more than anything informed by the letters that survive. Mm-hmm. And so Deborah couldn't spell particularly well by the conventional standards, nor could Jane, which is evidently a product of their lack of education. Women weren't taught to read the way that men were, and a lot of men weren't taught to read. It was forbidden for enslaved people in much of North America to learn how to read. So a lot of the people that Franklin does, a lot of the women that Franklin does carry on meaningful intellectual correspondence with, come from means or come from London. So, Madame Brionne, who is one of his correspondents in France, who he has just a very lively intellectual peer relationship with. Helvetius as well, Katie Green, Polly Stevenson. They had that, they could write. And that opened a lot of doors, even to women. But it certainly opened every door for Franklin, that he was as literate as he was early. And I know this isn't your question, but it's just important to me to think about literacy in America and how it was a lock and a key. It kept people from impact.
Well, you bring up a good question right there, David, because that's kind of where I wanted to ask you both next. Is something, I think timely about this series is that has a lot of undertones and a lot of, different points it's trying to make. But what kind of points do you both think really the viewer should resonate with and take away to look at modern day, American society and say, hey, this is how they were doing it back there. Maybe we should, understand and really look at those viewpoints for our society today.
Mm-hmm. We learned silence was a virtue, so I'll let Tom go first.
I think, again, when you look at the virtues, things like hard work, things like that, those are still values that we maintain and that we hold. But there's also, especially when we look at the rancorous politics of today, which is not new, by the way, there's been rancorous politics throughout our history and even in Franklin's time. But the way that you go back to the junto actually had rules. Here you have these 12 young men. They're all shopkeepers of some sort. They're middle class, which is very important to Franklin. That whole idea of middle class values, people that are actually making useful things for the populace and not necessarily profiting beyond their own labor. So again, with his patents, he never takes out a patent. But the idea of the junto, they were required to come in on Friday nights with a question or a subject that they wanted to talk about. And then there were rules. And for instance, you never directly contradicted anybody. If you wanted to make a point, you asked a question. You made a suggestion. The whole idea, I think Franklin actually used the word conviviality. The idea, this is a friendly conversation, and together we are going to come to a better place than that person who brought the initial question in. And so that whole idea of cooperation, and his whole life is about that. That's what he does on his diplomatic missions. It's okay. Let's get everybody. I'm not going to confront you. And he's annoyed at John Adams all the time, because John Adams is right in people's faces. Okay, and Franklin's like, oh my gosh, what's this guy doing? And he really tries to isolate Adams in France. But his idea, let's reason together. Look at kind of the old Johnson line. Let's reason together. But that's what he's doing. And we can certainly use a good dose of that today. And as we look at, again, the values that he's placing on himself, the self-examination that he goes through, again, the chart is hysterical. That's great. Those little black marks. All right, I failed in this one, I failed in that one, but I'm going to try to do better tomorrow. And those are just universal values that we do hold, really, at least many of us do, I think. They're not emphasized perhaps as much as they ought to be. But those are some of the things that I think people should look at and take away, that this really is a life worth examining. It's not perfect by any means, but it's worth examining, and it's worth examining the values that Franklin had then that carry over into who we are today.
Yep.
David, I'll let you go.
Franklin always talked about useful knowledge. I think knowing about Benjamin Franklin is useful. I think a lot of what became the United States and what remains the United States can be seen in his lifetime. He, like I think I said earlier, lived 70 years before the Declaration of Independence. So if you understand Franklin, you've got 7 decades of America before the United States. And if you understand Franklin, his last 15 years, he gave more than anybody to the founding of the American Republic. I think, as Tom was talking about, he believed in cooperation. He believed in collaboration, the same thing, I guess, but he didn't always give credit for his collaborators, that's for sure. Or we maybe don't give credit to him, because I'm lucky enough to work on a film where we get pages and pages of credits at the end, but the lightning rod isn't inscribed with everybody who gave him an idea. But he also stood for compromise, which has 2 connotations. One is, hey, let's meet in the middle and let's hammer this out. And the other is, I'm compromising my principles. And so you can look at the choices that he made, as we talked about in the film, at the Constitution through either of those lenses, and both are worth consideration. And then I also believe, I talked about this earlier, but I believe it's so important that, to me, always in the 4+ years I've been working with Benjamin Franklin, the thing that I keep thinking about is you can be wrong, and that's okay. And you can work to improve yourself. Poor Richard's best line, and as far as I'm concerned, is "The wise and brave dares own that he was wrong." And Franklin could do that. And so much today is doubling down on mistakes. Don't do that. It serves no social function. Might get you ahead, but at what cost?
And kind of with that, you kind of just touched a little bit upon that, David, but how long did it take you, Ken Burns, and the team really to research and dive into this? I know it's definitely got to be lengthy. I know you mentioned you guys reading the letters and things like that, and of course you probably had to travel not across just America, but probably also into Europe to some places that he stayed. But how long did it take you guys to really put this all together on the research and production side?
I was the first full-time employee on the project, and I began working on it March 1st of what year are we in now? 2018 is when I started. So like I said, just 4+. Now, we had already been working on it a little bit before that. We were already reading, we were already raising money, we were already talking about who we might want to interview, et cetera. But day to day, every day with Franklin, 4+ years for me. And then slowly we brought on more staff. And Ken was working on this too, but he works on so many films at the same time. So I would put it at 4 years, and that's a long process of research. And our first script was 8 hours long, and you got to cut that down. And frankly, there's enough in this man's life to have a much longer film than 4 hours. But I think 4 hours was the right length for the story we were trying to tell. in part because he lived before the photograph, and he's one of the best represented people of the 18th century because he was so famous in his time. But we can't know as much about him as we might Muhammad Ali, which is kind of sad if you think about it, because I think this man, like I said, he impacts us today.
Absolutely, I can't disagree with that. And David, it's something I want to ask you as being a former teacher, someone who's taught this to students. I don't know if you've ever, actually looked at, another, country's kind of style of view, but in your experience or your kind of teachings and looking at, when you went over to somewhere like the United Kingdom, what was their impact and view on Franklin? Now, we know Franklin spent a numerous amount of time in France and countries like that, but from the English perspective, a lot of times you hear about the American independence, and it's a lot different than what we would hear and learn in schools here. But what do you think a viewpoint for them on Franklin would be?
So I've never taught in a school, but I know that Benjamin Franklin's only surviving residence that he lived in his life that still stands is in London. And so the only place you can go where you can say, oh, Franklin, obviously he's been in Independence Hall and he's been in a lot of other places that stand in the United States. The only place you can go and say, Benjamin Franklin lives here, he hung his hat here, he stayed here, was the Stevenson's home on Craven Street in London. And the people at that museum, led by the founding director, Marcia Baliciano, and her staff, are devoted to getting the message of Franklin out to London and beyond. He's like a patron saint in France. There's a Rue Benjamin Franklin and a Rue near the Rue Yorktown, and that's on the west bank of the Seine, in Paris, just across from the Eiffel Tower. I think at the time of the French Revolution, which is when Franklin is just left France and is about to die, or maybe had died, he's like, they're holding him up as a statue the same way they're holding up like Plato. I don't even know if Plato was up there, but he was enormously popular there. How is he remembered today? I think he's remembered, but not the same way he's remembered here. He's on currency here, but he was enormously famous in his own time over there and around the world. We came across in researching this film, his autobiography republished in so many different languages. And one of my favorite pieces of art that we didn't make into the film, but was a woodcut, Japanese woodcut from the 19th century, where you can see Franklin in his home that looks suspiciously like it's in Japan. Doesn't look anything like what his real home, actually, I don't know, his real home doesn't stand, but it probably doesn't look like what his real home looked like. But you can see it being struck by lightning. And so his message is, I believe, universal. And I know that this film is going to have some legs abroad, and I hope people watch it.
Really, David, of course, I know you didn't know work at school, and I didn't mean to say your name, but I did want to hear your opinion on that. But Tom, that's kind of what I was trying to hit at, was that, what have you ever come across this in your time of looking at kind of schooling?
Not as much internationally, but again, what we teach here, unfortunately, one of the trends in current education is we kind of downplay the revolution because there's not a lot of time. One of the stories I tell people, I was in kindergarten in 1958. The social studies teacher in 11th grade teaching American history had 180 days to teach history. I retired in 2009, 51 years later. I still had 180 days to teach. So it becomes a game of what do you play, what do you emphasize, and what do you not emphasize. Now, I happen to be interested in colonial history, so I always taught something about Franklin, but it wasn't always required either. But again, what you hope to do in education is to create the same type of curiosity that Franklin had. Can I introduce an idea that is going to incite and excite these students in front of me so that then they will pick up the torch and carry it on? And I would think, obviously, David working on this project as long as he did, Ken Burns working on it. I did watch an interview with Walter Isaacson, who of course wrote one of the popular biographies. He started to research Franklin 11 years before he wrote the book. So it's not like there's no information out there. Can we present it in a rational form in the limited time we have? And is that being done abroad? Those are tough questions, but can we at the same time, again, excite? And a film like this is going to, I hope, do that. That people are now going to want to be curious. Let's go to the sources. Let's read some of the biographies. Let's examine some of those letters. and see what this guy was all about, beyond what the filmmaker was able to tell us in a very fine film for 4 hours.
And Tom,
Franklin
maybe
papers at Yale have been working on their project since the 1950s, and they're still editing Franklin's papers.
Yeah,
they're only up to, I think he's just leaving France now.
Yeah.
So he's still got 5 years left to live, which is, I'm sure he was writing a lot. And so you can literally, a whole team of people can give their lives to this man and still be giving us information that's super useful to telling his story.
And a question I had for both of you, but to start off, Tom, did Franklin introduce the term republic when we think of America? So a lot of people call it the American Republic.
Not really. The republic had been talked about in many years. You have Plato's Republic, of course. So it was a term that was well known and well used. The idea, however, is that a republic didn't actually exist at that time anywhere else. We're in a world of monarchies, and here we are going to try to do something on a continental scale that had never been tried before. Again, the Roman Republic was relatively small. Some of the republics that had existed here and there were all small. They were pretty much ethnically united, those types of things. This is a whole different game. This is an enormous group, a very diverse group, and we are going to try to put in place a government where the people select leaders from, yes, a qualified pool, and have them literally run this country in behalf of the people. So the idea, as it's modernized in Franklin's time, is a little different, and it's a revolutionary idea. This is something, it's theoretically out there, but now we're going to put it into reality, which is something Franklin had done for his whole life. Here's a theory, all right, let's make it useful, and that's what he does with Republic.
And kind of, I want to go back a little bit because both of you kind of have researched this topic, but a name that someone brought up in the chat was Deborah Reed and kind of her role in Franklin's life. And with you, David, I want to first ask, did her name come across your desk? I'm sure it did.
That's Franklin's wife that I was referring to earlier. Her birth name is Deborah Reed, and yeah, he's not who he is without her, for sure. She's from Philadelphia. Franklin's not. He's from Boston. And so he met her, as he says in his autobiography, on his first day in Philadelphia, and soon began renting his room from her parents. And he started courting her, and there was some talk of marriage. And then he said, "Oh, here's an opportunity to go to London," where he went for 18 months. When he came back, after a time, they began to see each other again. And due to some legal complications, never were officially married, entered into a common law marriage, and she took in his oldest son, William, who will never know who his mother was, but she raised him as though she were his mother. And then they had 2 children together, Francis Frankie Franklin, who died of smallpox at age 4, and Sarah Sally Bache, through whose line the only living descendants of Franklin come.
And Tom, I want to start with you on this question, then Dave, I want you to pick it up. For both of you kind of being history buffs, as everyone can see, how common was it for someone during this time period in the 1700s to have a business partnership with his wife?
It wouldn't have necessarily been official, but it happened all the time. And again, think in the Revolutionary time, who's going off to fight? Well, the men are going off to fight. Farms still have to be run. Businesses still have to be run. Who's doing that? Their wives are, their daughters are, their mothers are. Women are doing those things. And that's often overlooked. So is her name on the legal documents? No, because in many of the colonies, and then later on some of the states even, that was actually illegal. A woman had to have a special status from the legislature in order to own a business. Now, we do find women in some businesses, like tavern owners. There are a number of fairly famous women tavern owners in America at the time. So are they partners? Yes. Okay. Are they officially partners in the legal sense? No. But without them, the businesses aren't going to run. It's pretty much straightforward as far as that goes. And that's one of the things, of course, that changes over time with the women's movement.
And David, what's your perspective on that? I know you've definitely have, whether it be previous films you worked on or just being a history buff, as we think we all can see, kind of what is your perspective on that? Looking through it, is it a common thing that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, Tom hit the nail on the head. I just add a little color to that. That Benjamin Franklin's brother James, to whom Benjamin was first apprenticed when they were together in Boston. Excuse me. When he died, his wife took over their print operation. So that sort of thing could happen. When Benjamin Franklin's future father-in-law died, Deborah Reed's father died, his wife, Deborah's mother, became Franklin's landlady. So you could have, and Franklin had a landlady in London as well. Was it Margaret Stevenson?
Yes.
So, the opportunities often required something like death. But, people are doing the work, whether they're on the title. I think Tom said it well.
And I have one more question for both of you before we close out here. But this is kind of taken back to more of his statesman abilities and kind of the American Revolution. But I'll leave it with you, David, and then Tom, you can pick it up. What was, we of course see the French hatred of the British, and we have this intervention of them joining to help America fight in the War of Independence. But how much do you think the historical hatred, of course, the French and English been at war many times throughout their years, whether it be the 100 Years' War and many other wars in their history, but how much did that hatred play into their joining of America in the War of Independence?
I think it played an immense factor. I think it was a huge factor. I think, and I think Franklin knew that. I think he exploited it. I think that France had been humiliated in the 7 Years' War and had lost their territory in North America, and they may have been looking for an opportunity to get back at the English and the British, but they were waiting for the right opportunity. And when Franklin got there, it wasn't yet the right opportunity. So he was able to exploit the hatred to get some clandestine aid to support the upstart colonies, because the French knew, or at least they thought they knew, that an independent United States would be helpful for them in the global balance of power. Now, how it shook out in the end, America and Britain were still pretty closely tied together, and France ended up in the French Revolution, but that they didn't know. But in any case, yeah, I think that the hatred of England helped Franklin out a lot in winning his alliance that won the American Revolution.
And again, just to add to that, again, David hit on that. Remember that France, at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, they lose an enormous empire in North America. They lose Canada, for one, but they also lose a lot of islands in the Caribbean, which were very lucrative. That's where sugar was. So they lose that. They lose their influence. They also, remember, this is a world war as well. They lose parts of India. They lose parts of Africa. So they've lost a lot. And then the revolution starts, of course, just 12 years later. They're still stung. So, and as David said, they're not going to just jump into war with Great Britain again. They're not going to do that. But here's a kind of interesting, subtle way that they can, be the gadfly, if you want, on the horse's butt there. So we'll support these Americans. And then, of course, after Saratoga, when it looks like, gee, these Americans might actually win, now we can enter. And they're still, Admiral de Grasse and others are really interested in the Caribbean. The fact that they close off the Chesapeake, that's a sideline. They want those Caribbean colonies back. They use the war for that. But it's to our advantage that Franklin, and it is mostly Franklin, is able to kind of massage that hatred and that dislike and remind them of that history so that they come to our aid.
And just very quickly to build off of what Tom was saying, I think that the English hatred of the French also changed their war aims in 1778 when the French came in and they stopped paying as much attention to the continent, started worrying about those sugar islands, and took troops out of North America that had been maybe, who knows, might have been more successful in occupying and fighting this fighting this insurgency. Instead, they turned their attention elsewhere, and that was indirectly something that Franklin was able to exploit.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for tonight for this panel discussion. We hope you enjoyed this event surrounding the history and life of Benjamin Franklin. I want to thank David and Tom for joining me this evening and giving us some valuable insight and knowledge. I'd also like to thank everyone for attending. Be sure to keep an eye out on the WCNY website and social media for future events like tonight, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for joining us tonight. And don't miss the premiere of Benjamin Franklin, April 4th and 5th at 8 p.m. on WCNY TV.